People walked into that chapel. Not one walked out. Let me tell you about the summer of 1832, or as it's known in the Whitmore family Bible, the year God forgot Arkansas. I found most of the story stuffed in a moldy box in my nan's attic, right next to a jar of pickled okra and a handwritten journal that still smelled faintly like blood and cedarwood. It starts in Ashbridge, a farming town that, if you blinked while riding through, you'd miss it and probably be better off. That summer was a furnace. The Washita River had withered to a miserable trickle of brown sludge. Crops crumbled in the soil like ash, and half the livestock keeled over like they'd seen the devil himself. Spoiler alert, maybe they had. And then, right on cue, enter Reverend Ezekiel Thorne. Because, nothing says hope and healing like a preacher on a black horse carrying a Bible that looked suspiciously like it was bound in someone's actual skin. Human, not cow. I checked the stitching. The Lord is not deaf, only patient. Reverend Thorne from a page torn out of his journal. Fun fact, that journal was recovered from inside the chapel walls, right next to 3 vertebrae and a child's shoe. Now to the locals. 98 souls, all desperate, all sunburnt and half-cooked by drought and disease. Thorne looked like salvation, or at least like a last-ditch Hail Mary pass. They clung to their faith like it owed them money. Martha Whitmore, my great-great-great-aunt, cheers Martha, was among them. She walked up the dusty hill to St. Ephraim's chapel with her husband Samuel and 3 kids, including little Lucy, the only one smart enough to ask questions. Mama, why does the preacher man's eyes look so strange? She wasn't wrong. Thorne's eyes were wrong. Pale, watery blue. Not so much looking at you as through you. Like he was picking out which part of your soul he was going to keep. The chapel itself? Yeah, it shouldn't have still been standing. The wood was dark, like it had been soaked in something. Not rainwater. And the bell tower cast this shadow that didn't quite match the sun's position. Time didn't behave normally around that place. Neither did people. Martha said when they walked in it was cold. Like bone cold. Middle of August in Arkansas, and inside that chapel she could see her breath. Said it smelled like damp stone and wilted lilies, and something rotting under the floorboards. But sure, let's bring the kids. What could possibly go wrong? The congregation sat. All 98 of them. Thorne started preaching. And then no one ever left. No, really, not one person walked out. When a traveling merchant passed through 3 days later and saw the chapel doors still wide open, he went to investigate. What he found was, well, bits and pieces. The pews were empty, but soaked. The altar was covered in black wax and dried blood. And the air? It reeked of sulfur and singed hair. The church records listed the service as the deliverance of the 98. Deliverance to what exactly is still up for debate. Years later, in a confession scrawled in coal dust on the inside of a cellar door, a woman claiming to be the chapel's former caretaker wrote, "We fed him the town and he still wasn't full. I hear them in the walls, whispering hymns backwards. Forgive us." The cellar was buried in salt and sealed with iron. The chapel was raised in 1843 after 3 more disappearances, including a group of seminary students who thought it would be fun to investigate the legend. Spoiler, they found more than they bargained for, including fingernail scratches 6 feet deep in the stone foundation. So yeah, the next time some pale-eyed preacher shows up with a leather satchel and a suspicious-looking Bible, maybe, just maybe, don't follow him into a building that smells like wet grave dirt and sounds like it's breathing when the wind picks up. Because history doesn't always repeat. Sometimes it waits, and sometimes it hunts. I found the rest of the Ashbridge records tucked behind a false wall in my uncle's toolshed. Real cliché horror movie stuff like actual wallpaper peeling, strange symbols carved into the wood, and a stack of yellowed pages wrapped in oilcloth and what I hope was dried possum hide. Or not. We'll never know. Inside was a page from a sermon, dated August 14th, 1832, with one line circled in blood-red ink. "The door shall shut, and the choir of flesh shall sing." So that's comforting. Now, when Reverend Thorne greeted Samuel Whitmore that morning, the tone was off. Witnesses, or what's left of their accounts, said his voice had a strange resonance, like it was echoing off bones instead of wood. You know when someone sings in a cathedral and the sound just lingers a second too long? It was like that, except outside. In open air. With no acoustics and no mercy. "Welcome, Brother Whitmore," he said, smiling like he'd already picked out his favorite rib. As the congregation shuffled into St. Ephraim's chapel, something shifted. The heat outside, which had been smothering all summer, suddenly vanished. Like stepping into a root cellar. Cold. Damp. Still. A few folks later said they saw their breath hang in the air, but no one wanted to say that out loud. And then there were the crows. Because, of course, there were crows. A whole murder of them, up in the rafters, watching like judges at a trial no one knew they'd already lost. Old Henrik Johansson, local blacksmith and the last man you'd expect to own anything delicate, pulled out his pocket watch. It had stopped. Just done. Completely frozen. Same time for everyone who had won. 10:07 a.m. The exact moment they crossed the threshold. Timothy Fletcher's bouquet of wildflowers wilted the second it touched the pew. Not even dramatically, just flop. Like they knew what was coming and gave up early. But people were too desperate to care. Disease was tearing through the town, and half the babies born that summer never made it to their first bath. So when a preacher shows up promising answers, no one questions his book cover made of probably human leather. Thorne climbed into the pulpit like it was a throne he'd earned in blood. The light through the stained glass twisted around him, casting shadows that didn't match his body. At one point, his silhouette stretched across the whole chapel wall, and blinked according to one surviving drawing found later in the schoolhouse attic. "Dearly beloved," he said, and somehow everyone felt it in their spines. "Today we shall speak of sacrifice, of devotion, and of the price that true faith demands." That's when the chapel doors slammed shut behind them. Loud, final, like a guillotine dropping. And no, there was no wind, not even a draft. One man, Jacob Aldridge, tried to open the door. Said it burned his hands, like touching a stove. The wood had turned ice cold and hot at the same time, and it wouldn't budge. He had blisters. He died 2 days later with his tongue black and his mouth full of centipedes. Not kidding. Back inside, Martha Whitmore looked down at her baby, James. He'd gone still in her arms. That terrifying, statuesque stillness babies only do when something's very wrong. She looked into his face, and his eyes? Pale blue, just like thorns. And he was mouthing words, not baby babble but actual phrases. Prayers. In Latin. He was 7 months old. Never learned a word. But there he was, speaking like he'd been raised by monks and nightmares. The room fell silent as Thorne opened his Bible. Or whatever it was. The pages moved on their own, flipping as if they had memory. The writing didn't stay still, it wriggled, like worms trying to escape ink. Some folks swore it was in Enochian. Others said it was English but backward and alive. And the smell? God. Everyone described it. A thick, choking scent, sulfur, yes, but also something wet. Something sweet. Like if you mixed decaying meat with rosewater and buried it under a church for 50 years. It was in their hair, their teeth. One child started crying and couldn't stop until her nose bled. "Fear not the darkness that comes before the light," Thorne said. "For in the deepest shadow, we find the truest illumination." Except his voice didn't come from his mouth anymore. Came from everywhere. The walls, the floorboards, the rafters. It rang like bells and scraped like nails. And the congregation, all 98 of them, sat frozen, back straight, eyes forward, like something had clicked, like something inside them had finally said, yes. None of them left that chapel, and no bodies were ever found. But the building? It stood there until 1843, when lightning struck it on a clear night and it burned from the inside out. They say the fire didn't touch the outside wood, just the air within. And in the ashes, they found one thing untouched. Thorne's Bible, still open, still breathing. I didn't even believe half of this, until I found my great-aunt Edie's diary stuffed in a biscuit tin under the chapel floorboards. Water damaged, pages fused together with mildew and regret. She'd scribbled something on the back of a hymn sheet that never left me. They didn't come for our prayers. They came for the silence after. Now, if you've ever sat through a sermon so long you felt your bones aging, imagine that, but with frostbite, demonic hypnosis, and your baby quoting the Necronomicon. Samuel Whitmore, a man whose entire personality revolved around growing corn and suppressing emotions, tried to stand. You know, typical husband stuff. Protect the wife, save the kids, ignore the eldritch horror in the rafters. But the poor sod couldn't move. No one could. They were all just stuck, like beetles frozen in amber, or parishioners held hostage by cosmic bureaucracy. And Reverend Thorne? Oh, he was in full performance mode now. Voice like syrup poured over a hot stove, words curling and coiling into everyone's brains, bypassing reason and boring straight into the oldest parts of the human soul. The lizard brain. The bit we like to pretend evolved past ritual sacrifice. The Lord, he crooned, demands not just your worship, but your essence, your life force, your eternal souls. So, standard church stuff. And as he preached, the temperature dropped like a stone in a well. Not in that cozy winter chapel way either. More like someone opened a rift to a frozen hell dimension kind of cold. Frost bloomed across the windows. You could see your breath misting in front of your face. And not in a ho-ho-ho, hot cocoa way, but more like, we're all about to be flash-frozen sacrifices to a star god. I mean, poor old Mary Hutchinson? 16. Barely married. Her wedding ring, started burning against her skin. The gold turned black right on her finger, like it had just remembered who it really belonged to. And she wasn't the only one. Jewelry corroded. Dresses frayed and unraveled at the seams like they'd aged a century in seconds. Hair turned white at the roots. The air stank of sulfur and something else. Something wet, like rotting orchids soaked in bleach and bile. One kid threw up quietly into his lap. No one even noticed. That Bible? The thing Thorne slapped on the pulpit like a showman? It started humming. Low and constant. Like an insect hive buried in a coffin. The pages flipped on their own. Fresh blood smeared across the vellum. Because of course it was vellum. This wasn't a guy using cheap pulp paper. No, Thorne went full skin-bound scripture. The blood letters lifted off the page, hovered in the air like smoke, and just burned themselves into everyone's brains. Blessed are those who give all, the words whispered. For they shall inherit not the earth, but something far greater. Eternal unity with the divine darkness that dwells between the stars. Yeah. That warm and fuzzy Sunday sermon. Henrik Johansson, the town blacksmith, he glanced out the chapel window, probably trying to ground himself. Like, hey, maybe the outside world still exists. Maybe this is just heatstroke hallucinations and bad corn whiskey. But the fields? Gone. The town? Gone. All he saw was an infinite black void, writhing with shadows and distant lights that pulsed in colors your brain didn't have names for. Looking at it hurt. Not like metaphorical hurts your heart hurt. I mean retinal migraine, your soul curling up like an old receipt kind of hurt. And the kids? Oh, they'd stopped crying. Every single one of them. Just silent. Staring straight ahead. Unblinking. Their tiny faces frozen in expressions of beatific rapture. Like toddlers at a BB's concert, but make it Lovecraftian mind meld. Even baby James, the infant literal potato with a heartbeat, was speaking. Except what came out of his mouth wasn't anything recognizable. The sounds were guttural, ancient, wrong. Think whale song run through a blender with an old modem. Now, I wasn't there, obviously. I wasn't even alive. But my family never rebuilt after Ashbridge. No one did. That chapel burned 3 days later. No survivors, no bodies, not even ashes. Just a scorched circle of dead earth and a Bible page nailed to a tree with handwriting no one could read. The stars are patient, it said. But the congregation is ready. Look, I don't know what you believe about religion, rituals, or the finer points of spiritual ascension. But if your church roof opens up and reveals a swirling cosmic pit of teeth and stars, maybe don't stick around for the sermon. That's exactly what happened during the so-called Ashbridge anointing, as it's been euphemistically called in the few surviving records. I only stumbled across the details because my great-uncle Martin, the town's undertaker at the time, kept a very unsettling diary. One entry, dated August 12, 1832, just says, "The ceiling screamed today, peeled itself back like wet bark. No one screamed. They just walked into the maw. So, that's nice." Anyway, this was the moment Reverend Ezekiel Thorne finally dropped the whole, "I'm totally a man of God" act and asked the congregation to, in his words, step forward and demonstrate the depth of their faith. Yeah, because what every rural family wants after heatstroke and dead cattle is to casually hand over their immortal soul. And people did step forward. Not out of courage, but like puppets on invisible strings. Faces beatific, eyes hollow. The kind of expression you might wear just before plunging into a meat grinder you're convinced leads to heaven. The first to go was Matthew Whitmore, 14 years old. Martha's boy. She was frozen in place, physically, mentally. Imagine watching your son walk straight into hell and you can't even scream his name. The altar, which up until now had been a plain, modest structure, had started to change. And I don't mean symbolically. I mean geometrically. It bent in ways that defied physics, like it belonged in a room with no dimensions. Symbols slithered across the wood, rearranging themselves like living things. Looking directly at them made your thoughts fuzz at the edges, like something gnawing on your sanity from the inside. And then came Jeremiah Cobb. Jeremiah, town miller, widower, war veteran, proud owner of a goat named Ruth, stepped forward and laid both hands on that altar like it was communion bread and not an interdimensional blender. The moment he touched it, everything changed. His body arched violently. He let out this noise, not quite a scream, not quite a prayer, just raw soul noise, like every word he'd ever swallowed came out at once. And then his skin shimmered, literally shimmered like heat waves over pavement. He started to fade. I don't mean metaphorically. I mean translucent. His eyes went pure white. His jaw unhinged, almost comically wide, if it hadn't been so disturbing. And then something silvery and pulsing left his chest, like his soul had been distilled into moonlight and was now being vacuumed into the altar's writhing runes. "The first offering is accepted," Thorne announced, like a game show host announcing a prize. He was glowing at this point, not metaphorically. His face was glowing, but not with light, more like a distortion, like the flesh wasn't quite syncing with the thing wearing it anymore. And that's when everyone else started getting up. The Hutchinson twins. Sarah Fletcher, only 10. Mrs. Pemberton, who hadn't walked since her stroke, now marching down the aisle like she'd just been cast in The Exorcist. Senior edition. The air turned syrup thick. Breathing felt like sucking molasses through a straw. The walls iced over, the kind of frost you find on corpses after too many hours in the walk-in freezer. Patterns formed in the frost. Guess what kind? Yep. The same eldritch symbols now glowing on the altar like a Windows 95 screensaver designed by Satan. Samuel Whitmore, bless his heart, tried to speak. Managed one word. Stop. Came out like a ghost sigh, useless, unheard. Thorne turned and smiled. Not a warm, forgiving shepherd smile. No, it split his face open ear to ear. I mean that literally, his jaw seemed to unhinge sideways. Like whatever was inside was just done pretending to be human. "You misunderstand the nature of this blessing, Brother Whitmore," Thorne said, his voice echoing now, like there were 3 versions of him speaking from different layers of reality. "Your son is not being taken. He is being elevated. He is becoming part of something infinitely greater than his mortal flesh could ever contain. Elevated. That's what they called it in the last chapel ledger entry too. Scrawled in the margins in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. They ascended through the bones of the altar. Elevated. Enlightened. Erased. The chapel was found weeks later empty. No sign of the 98 townsfolk. No blood. No bodies. Just that same altar. Quiet. Still humming faintly. Smelled like burnt hair and peppermint. To the viewer. So, yeah. Next time someone says, "Give yourself fully to the Lord," maybe ask which Lord. And if the chapel starts freezing over in August and babies start speaking dead languages, maybe just fake a nosebleed and leave. You're not being elevated. You're being consumed. I'll cover what happened after, the cover-up, the sealed records, and what some idiot tried to summon in 1978 with a copy of the Thorn Bible in Part 5. See you then. Or, unless you get called. I found the transcript in a ruined farmhouse just off Old Miller's Road, tucked inside a rusted tin under floorboards warped from decades of humidity, and what I really hope was just rot. The pages were brittle, but legible, handwritten by someone calling themselves M.W., and dated November 3rd, 1946. One line stood out, scrawled over and over in increasingly erratic handwriting. He said 89, but there were 98. Anyway, let's talk about what happened after the altar started feeding. Matthew Whitmore, 14 years old, good at spelling bees, scared of thunderstorms, reached the altar like he was sleepwalking through a nightmare no one else could see. He turned just once to look back at his parents. His face, serene, angelic even, like he'd just been told he could skip finals forever. But his eyes, oh those eyes, wide, glassy, and screaming in a way his mouth never did. I understand now, Papa, he said. Only it wasn't his voice anymore. It was too hollow, too harmonic, like a choir whispering through a drainpipe. I understand what we're meant to become. Yes, the classic possessed by the divine dread moment, a church crowd favorite. When Matthew touched the altar, the same silvery light as before began to leak from his chest. But this time, something extra joined the party. Black, oily tendrils slithered from the chapel's corners, wrapping themselves around the rest of the congregation like they were all just meat puppets at a seance. And here's where it clicks. They weren't just watching the ceremony. They were the ceremony. Henrik Johansson, local blacksmith, big hands, small imagination, figured it out first. You could see the realization hit him in real time, like a dog hearing thunder 5 seconds too late. Every person in that room had a thread of shadow connecting them to the altar, and it was tugging, siphoning their life force like they were plugged into some unholy generator. Real crowd participation vibes. The Bible on Reverend Thorne's podium? It started floating because of course it did, flipping wildly as new pages wrote themselves. Ink bled across parchment, spelling out names, one by one, as if it were a guest list at the worst dinner party in human history. Even little Lucy Whitmore, 8, asthmatic, smarter than most adults, noticed something none of the grown-ups did. The crows. You remember those, right? Still perched in the rafters like discount gargoyles. Every time a soul got devoured, one of them cawed. Loud, sharp, rhythmic. Tick, tick, tick. Like a very polite demon accountant was keeping track. And the temperature? Hell froze over. Literally. Ice began creeping over the pews, over their clothes, crystallizing on eyelashes. Old folks stopped breathing entirely, but they didn't fall. They just sat there, statues with smiles carved into their faces. Still alive, technically, but also a not. That chapel stretched like it had something to prove. Walls pulled upward like rubber, warping. The ceiling tore open not to the sky, but to this, cosmic oil spill. A swirling void lit with stars that twitched. Stars that watched back. Then there was Thorne. The human suit was falling apart. His limbs grew wrong, longer, segmented, insectoid. His voice fractured, layered like 5 different beings arguing in unison. The harvest is bountiful, he announced to God. The void? Yelp reviewers? Unclear. 98 souls freely given in the name of faith. The compact is nearly complete. Nearly. That's what Martha Whitmore, Matthew's mum, caught on to. One word. Nearly. Not complete. And when you're being drained like a Capri Sun by an eldritch altar, one word is all you get. Her breath fogged in front of her face. Her vision swam. The tendril attached to her chest was tugging harder, hungrily. But she held on barely, focusing on what the Reverend didn't have yet. And that's when she saw it, baby James, still in her arms, still warm, the only child who hadn't been summoned forward. His eyes had that pale, glowy tint, sure, but they weren't empty. They weren't lost like the others. Something about him didn't fit the ritual. Like whatever dark force was orchestrating this harvest couldn't quite get a grip on him. Too pure, maybe, or too stubborn. Babies are like that sometimes. And here's the thing no one else noticed. Only 89 people had been consumed. Not 98. 9 remained. And Thorn needed those last few for whatever hellish pact he'd struck. Scroll historical note from local archives. An entry in a 1947 post-disaster report written by Sheriff Eli Warren reads, "We never found the chapel. Not even rubble. Just frost-burned trees in a perfect circle and 98 dead crows nailed upside down to the trunks. The youngest survivor was a 6-month-old infant. He wouldn't stop crying until we took him out of town. He stopped the moment we crossed the county line." So yeah, the ritual wasn't complete yet. But the real question is, who's going to finish it? And are you absolutely sure you weren't born in Bartow County? Just asking. For the ledger. I first came across the records of St. Ephraim's final congregation when cleaning out my stepdad's storage unit. Box labeled hymnals and junk. Inside, not hymns. Just water-stained church bulletins, Polaroids that shouldn't move but do, and a leather-bound diary belonging to Mrs. Abigail Pemberton. One line was scrawled in red ink across a sermon insert. God was never in the room. Let that set the tone. So, by this point in the story, the ritual's in full demonic bloom. The altar's humming like an overworked microwave. People are freezing solid mid-amen. And the air smells like a mix of old hymn books and electrical fire. Oh, and in the middle of this apocalyptic Pinterest board of gothic decay, a toddler named Emma. She's 3. And somehow she's still praying. While everyone else is playing zombie pew potato, Emma's whispering the bedtime prayer her gran taught her. Like the tiniest resistance fighter in church socks. Her hands clasped so tight they've gone white. Lips moving with a defiance that doesn't belong in someone who still thinks clouds are edible. And that's when Henrik, Emma's grandfather, has a revelation. Not the divine kind. The "oh God we messed up" kind. See, the ritual only works on willing participants. You have to choose to be consumed. Faith freely given, not dragged screaming. But true innocence? The kind uncorrupted by sermons, guilt, or creepy reverends with centipede limbs. That kind of faith burns a little too clean for this hellrite to digest. Across the chapel, baby James lets out a cry. But it's not a regular baby meltdown. No, this was musical. A single high-pitched note, piercing and pure, like the opening chord of a hymn. And suddenly, like something out of a very confused musical, other children joined in. Not words, just sound. Harmony. It was beautiful. Horrifying, but beautiful. The tendrils recoiled like they'd been slapped with holy water. The altar's creepy alien runes started flickering like a dodgy light bulb. The temperature rose just a bit. Not by much, but enough that you could hear frost cracking on someone's jacket. Parents stirred. Like real movement. One woman let out a sob as the tendril around her chest slipped off like a cold scarf. Samuel Whitmore stood. He'd been half dead 2 minutes ago, but now he looked like he could fist-fight a deity. "You're not taking them," he shouted. "Look, I get goosebumps every time I hear that part." Reverend Thorne, or whatever was wearing his skin like a second-hand blazer, didn't take it well. His head twisted at an angle not even chiropractors would touch. "They belong to the covenant now," he snarled. And this time his voice didn't even bother pretending to be human. Came in layers. Like, if an entire radio choir got possessed mid-song. And then, Mrs. Pemberton, 89 years old, arthritic, blind in one eye, and apparently a holy badass. She hadn't touched the altar. Everyone assumed she had. But nope, her hand had hovered above it the whole time. Just close enough for the ritual to assume she was in, but not close enough to seal the deal. And she remembered. Somehow, through the fog, through the frostbite and the existential terror, she remembered what real faith felt like. "This isn't God's work," she said. "This is something else. Something that feeds on our desperation and calls it devotion." And boom, spell broken. Minds clearing. A few folks even started crying like they just woke up from a very disturbing group nap. That's when the chapel exploded. Not literally. Spiritually. Windows shattered as Thorne screeched. A frequency that made my headphones vibrate when I first listened to the tape. His disguise collapsed. Gone was the preacher with the kind eyes and folksy accent. In his place, a creature from between. That's what the local folklore calls it, between. As in, not hell, not space, but whatever cosmic alleyway things like thorns skulk through. A writhing shadow of tendrils and bone that looked like it was trying to remember how to be a person and failing spectacularly. You cannot resist, it howled. The compact is sealed. The harvest must be completed. But the kids kept singing. Simple. Soft. Jesus loves me. I mean, of all songs to use in an exorcism, right? But that's what made it so perfect. It was earnest. And it hurt the thing. Every note made it shrink, scream, flicker. The symbols on the altar cracked like cheap pottery. The ceiling, which until recently had opened into a void full of pulsating anti-stars, started pulling shut, revealing patches of normal, mortal, merciful sky. But this wasn't the end. The thing that was thorn wasn't done. Its tendrils lashed out in fury, burning where they touched skin. One kid got hit on the arm, left a mark that looked like an inverted cross made of scar tissue. Still hasn't faded, even today. Yes, he's still alive. Barely. Still, the hymn didn't stop. More voices joined. Parents, survivors, even a few that had nearly been taken. The song became a wall, and whatever thorn was, couldn't cross it. Journal of Reverend Ernest Thorne, page 43, recovered fragment. The children are wrong. They do not doubt. I cannot reach them. This wasn't just a haunting. It wasn't a possession. It was a harvest of belief, of hope twisted into sacrifice. And they fought back with faith. Not the institutional kind. The real kind. The kind you whisper into a child's ear before bed. The kind that doesn't care about theology or ceremony. Just love. It bought them time. Maybe a lifetime. Maybe less. But Saint Ephraim? It never opened its doors again. And the last line written in Pemberton's journal, dated the morning after, still gives me chills. He was not the first to wear a collar, and he won't be the last. You ever hear a baby outsing a demon? Yeah, me neither, until I stumbled across the Whitmore files tucked in a busted lockbox behind my grandmother's piano. She used to play hymns on Sundays like they were spells. Turns out, maybe they were. Inside that box, wedged between water-damaged sheet music and a hand-carved crucifix that reeked of mildew and regret, was a journal entry from Reverend Ellison. Yes, the real Reverend, not the thing that wore his skin later. In it, he'd written, "Faith isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet whisper of a child refusing to be afraid." Well, apparently that whisper turned into a goddamn war cry. Martha Whitmore. Yes, that Martha, the one who threw a Bible at a shadow tendril and dared it to hit her back, was clutching her infant like the world depended on his lungs. Spoiler, it kind of did. Baby James, all curls and confusion, had somehow become the choir director of this exorcism in progress. His voice, too young to be corrupted, too pure to be silenced. And let me tell you, it wasn't some Disney sparkle magic crap. It was raw. There was snot. There was terror. But that little hymn sliced through the chapel's oppressive gloom like a blade. One of those old, rusty ones you find in a shed and instinctively know has a body count. The shadow tendrils? They started recoiling like someone had turned on the lights at a cockroach convention. The ritual, whatever nightmarish celestial contract they were all unknowingly part of, began to unravel. But of course, horror never lets you win clean. Matthew Whitmore, Martha's older son, was already gone. Half gone, technically. His soul, or what was left of it, hung above the altar like a translucent moth with PTSD. Others were there too, flickering echoes of the people who'd been devoured by the ritual. Faces stretched, eyes pleading, skin shimmering like they were made of oil and memory. Henrik Johansson, the village blacksmith with forearms like church pews, decided he'd had enough theological bullsh** tea for one day. He chucked an actual pew at the writhing monster above the altar. Passed right through, but honestly, it was the vibe that mattered. Samuel Whitmore stood tall, well, wobbled tall, and placed his hat back on his head like it was a crown. Symbolic defiance. Bit dramatic, but we'll allow it. "You want our souls?" he shouted. "Then come take him." We're not giving them up to your lies. A plus horror movie one-liner, Sam. Shame it pissed the creature off so much it ripped reality in half. The walls buckled like wet cardboard. The floor cracked open and revealed that same hungry, swirling void, the one that had eaten the windows earlier. Standard hellmouth decor. But the hymn, that stupidly innocent tune, held steady, like duct tape holding back the apocalypse. Mrs. Pemberton, still clinging to that altar like she was bargaining with death himself, whispered to the trapped souls, "Come back to us. Remember who you are. Remember what you truly believe." And wouldn't you know it, they did. Matthew Whitmore blinked. His ghost face shifted. His hands reached toward his baby brother. And then, get this, a thread of actual blinding light arced between them. No, not metaphorical light. I mean, it burned. The shadows hissed like they'd touched holy fire. That's when it clicked. It wasn't just faith. It was family. Love. That corny crap you roll your eyes at in Sunday school because it's usually followed by an envelope begging for tithes. Mrs. Pemberton, who, I remind you, once tried to beat a demon with a hymnal, muttered, "Love is stronger than whatever dark covenant this thing forged." And it was. Parents grabbed the wispy, barely their hands of their lost kids. Spouses shouted names through the howling dark. Friends linked arms with phantoms. Every one of those connections, another nail in the coffin of whatever the hellthorn had become. The altar cracked, like actually cracked. The alien sigils faded like chalk in a rainstorm. The chapel, once a vacuum of warmth and reason, began to feel real again. The temperature lifted. That weird, wet copper smell evaporated. Ice melted down the walls, revealing peeling paint and water damage that somehow felt comforting. The entity, the shrieking, reality-warping thing that had masqueraded as a shepherd of souls, screamed. One last time. A sound that made teeth itch and ears bleed and hearts stall. Then it collapsed in on itself. A dying star. A failed god. The void receded. Sky returned. Physics, bless her clumsy, comforting self, stumbled back into the room like someone who'd left the oven on. For the first time in hours or decades, depending on who you asked, St. Ephraim Church was just a church again. But don't let the sunlight fool you. This story doesn't end with a sunrise. Because things like this, they don't really end. They wait. You ever walk out of a nightmare and realize the real horror's just beginning? Yeah. That was us. The entity was gone, or at least somewhere else, chewing on reality with fewer witnesses. But the chapel didn't survive its little possession problem. Turns out, when you marinate a building in unspeakable cosmic evil for a few decades, the architecture takes it personally. First came the groaning, not like haunted house theatrics. I mean full-blown, agonized bone-deep cracking. Then the beams dropped, the walls curled inward, and the floor, well, she gave up altogether in places, just opened wide like a mouth that wanted to swallow the rest of us out of spite. Everyone out. Henrik Johansson, yes, him again, the Viking with anger issues and a moral compass, shouted like God had given him a megaphone. No one questioned it. Even the dead ones didn't hesitate. And just like that, the doors, the ones that had been sealed tighter than a coffin, swung open like they'd never held a grudge. Morning sunlight spilled in. Arkansas countryside, humid and unbothered. The kind of normal that feels like an insult after what we'd seen. I remember stumbling outside barefoot, half-deaf, smelling like old blood and burnt sugar. Martha Whitmore was counting heads like a schoolteacher on a field trip to hell. 89 souls in, 89 souls out. Though honestly, souls is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Some of us weren't entirely ourselves anymore. Behind us, St. Ephraim's finally gave up the ghost. It collapsed inward like a man shot through the heart. There wasn't even a scream, just a heavy, final thud, and then silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind that makes your ears ring because something is missing. And the smell. You know that sulfurous tang? Like fireworks soaked in rot? That stayed. Clung to skin. Got in your pores. We tried washing it off. Didn't work. Still doesn't, sometimes. There was one stone, just one left half exposed in the rubble. On it, Scorched deep and dark like a brand, was a single handprint. Not carved. Burned. 5 fingers too long. Palm wide. Like something had gripped the foundation in its final moments trying to hold on. Or leave a message. You decide which is worse. We stood there, blinking in the light. Whole technically. Alive debatably. Changed? God, yes. Every single person looked like they'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. You don't unsee the moment your faith nearly kills you. And of course, the government showed up. Right on cue. 3 days later, like clockwork. All beige suits, clipboards, and tight-lipped smiles. The state sent investigators. Because nothing screams resolution, like bureaucrats interviewing trauma survivors in a pile of smoldering rubble. 89 witnesses, all saying the same impossible thing. Preacher turned demon. A ritual that nearly erased us. Screaming shadows. Floating souls. A baby hymn that undid hell. They nodded, took notes, and labeled it exactly what you'd expect. Mass hysteria due to environmental stress and elevated temperatures during a period of drought. Right? Because clearly we hallucinated the part where the floor turned into a black hole and swallowed the altar. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, the state's head investigator, was especially keen to debunk our trauma. A man of science and zero imagination, with a mustache that looked like it hadn't known joy since the Nixon administration. In his official report, which I found a photocopy of in the church ruins, by the way, he wrote, "The townspeople, under significant meteorological and emotional strain, experienced a collective psychogenic episode. There is no evidence of occult activity, nor structural sabotage. The cause of the collapse is consistent with water damage and rot." Funny, we didn't mention the rot. But he wasn't wrong. Not about the rot. Here's a detail they left out. In 1964, long before the chapel became cursed real estate, a young deacon named Elijah Murray vanished during Lent. No note, no body, just gone. His Bible was found open to the Book of Job, and a single human tooth was lodged between the pages. The case was never solved. But guess whose name was on the First Communion roll Thorne signed when he arrived in town? Yep, Elijah Murray. We think the entity wore him first. People ask me sometimes why I stayed in Ashbridge after that. I tell them I didn't. Not really. My body's here, sure. But part of me's still in that chapel, listening to that hymn, wondering which shadow's going to blink first. Faith is a weapon. That's true. But weapons leave wounds, even when you survive. So when you drive past the field where St. Ephraim once stood, because yes, they bulldozed it, salted the earth, put a fence around it like trauma needs a border. Look closely at the rubble. One stone remains, half buried in moss. And if you see the handprint, don't touch it. And for God's sake, don't hum. You know how official reports love to wrap the unexplainable in a tidy little bow. Mass hysteria, they say. A lovely catch-all phrase for we don't want to admit what really happened. That's what Dr. Cornelius Blackwood wrote. Anyway, the citizens of Ashbridge have clearly suffered a shared psychological episode, likely triggered by extreme weather conditions and their desperate circumstances. No evidence of supernatural activity has been found. And yet, Dr. Blackwood, for all his crisp lab coats and smug disbelief, couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. I mean, when 89 people give you the same story, down to the scorched altar symbols and the floating baby who spoke Latin backwards, maybe, just maybe, it's not the heat. Let me backtrack for a second. I found this story buried in an old shoebox at my grandmother's house. She kept it with her war letters and photos of people no one in the family could name. The journal that started it all was in there. A cracked, leather-bound relic smelling like smoke and iron. It belonged to Reverend Ezekiel Thorne, yes, that Thorne. And it's, well, let's say it makes the Necronomicon look like a church bulletin. The final entry was dated the morning of the chapel collapse. The harvest approaches completion. 89 souls have been prepared for the offering. Their faith corrupted and redirected toward the true masters who dwell in the spaces between stars. Yeah. Masters who dwell between the stars. Because of course this has to end with a cosmic horror twist. I mean, why just traumatize a congregation when you can also casually drop the suggestion of ancient gods making soul souffle out of small-town farmers? There were other entries too, references to towns across the frontier that disappeared overnight, places no longer on any map, where churches stood empty and pews still smelled of scorched wood and old blood. One in particular stuck with me, Eagle Hollow, Nebraska, 1871. Population 102. Gone. A traveling priest was found 3 weeks later, wandering naked in a wheat field muttering about the eyes behind the veil. And the worst part? The handwriting in Thorne's journal moved. Literally. I stared at it for 10 minutes and watched the loops twist like worms, rearranging into fresh sentences I swear weren't there before. My hands still smelled like ozone for hours after touching it, like standing next to a broken fuse box during a thunderstorm. But back to Dr. Blackwood. He could have blown the lid off the whole thing. Instead, he did what every bureaucrat does best. Filed it away, labeled it religious extremism, and shoved it so far into the state archives it probably shares a shelf with the Ark of the Covenant and Jimmy Hoffa. Ashbridge, meanwhile, tried to pretend it was all over. The drought broke a week later. A miraculous rain that smelled too clean, like sterile hospital air. The children recovered from their fevers. The livestock stopped dropping dead. And life marched on like the whole town hadn't flirted with interdimensional doom over brunch. But no one really forgot. Martha Whitmore wouldn't let baby James out of her sight. Not after he spoke a dead tongue with glowing eyes during the ritual. She used to be the type to host bake sales. Now she sharpens knives and sleeps with a salt circle around the crib. Samuel Whitmore, her brother, practically turned into the town's unofficial gatekeeper. He tracks who enters, who leaves, who lingers too long at the chapel ruins. He carries a notebook where he logs every single unusual occurrence. According to my copy, there were 16 in the first year alone. And then there's the stone. Just one. Still there in the rubble. Most people ignore it or pretend they don't see it, but if you look closely, and I mean really look, you'll find it. Half buried. Blackened. Warm to the touch even in winter. And on it, a single handprint. Burned in. Like someone or something touched it with a hand that wasn't exactly human. You know what's funny? After all that, the town still holds services. Not in the same chapel, obviously, that one's gone, swallowed by God knows what, but in the school gymnasium. They still pray, still sing hymns, still pretend the thing in the chapel wasn't real. But they don't let strangers lead worship anymore. And they sure as hell don't use the old hymnals. Because they've learned something most of us forget. Sometimes, when you pray hard enough, something actually answers. And it's not always God on the other end of the line. You know how it goes. Big, unsettling events happen, and people eventually forget. Sure, they make the headlines at first. Town goes mad. 89 souls vanish. Then they get filed away. When a place like Ashbridge goes through something that cosmic, it's easier to pretend it didn't happen. The records get sealed. The survivors speak in hushed tones, and in time, it becomes just another folklore tale to tell around a campfire. When the rain's pouring and the wind's howling. The chapel? Collapsed. The entity? Probably long gone, right? Wrong. You see, 1924 rolls around, and along comes this eager little historian named Eleanor Marsh. I mean, who goes looking for trouble, right? But Eleanor, bless her heart, found a reference to Ashbridge while researching frontier religious movements. Well, this'll be fun, she probably thought. I'll just dig around and solve some mysterious incident from the past. Yeah, that always works out well. She finds her way to the state archives, which, by the way, is basically just a room filled with dust, rat nests, and secrets the government would rather stay dead. And what does she find? Dr. Cornelius Blackwood's special files on the Ashbridge incident. Those same files that everyone swore were buried deep enough to keep them safe. Apparently, Blackwood wasn't as scientifically rational as he thought he was, because he couldn't even keep his damn journal hidden. He should have known that one day, some curious soul would come looking for answers. Too bad for him, that curious soul was Eleanor. And let me tell you what she found. What she really found. It wasn't just the story of Ashbridge. It was an account, a map, and a nightmare. Reverend Ezekiel Thorne's journal wasn't just a scribbled collection of my cult's really serious guy's musings. No, The man had detailed locations, maps, names, coordinates, marking towns across the frontier where similar rituals had been tried before. Because nothing says, just another Sunday service, like cosmic soul harvesting. These places, gone. Vanished without a trace. Maybe the same thing happened in your town, just buried under a little dust and good intentions. And don't get me started on the grand convergence. That's what Thorne called it. Anyway, a big, shiny moment when enough souls are stacked up, ready to open a gateway. Now let's pause here. Think about the implications. These were people, farmers, shopkeepers, families, who were sacrificed, all for the glory of some entity that wanted to tear open the fabric of reality and let it all flood through. Call it a cosmic harvest, if you will. It's the stuff that nightmares are made of. But no one wanted to listen. Not when there's a nice, shiny, scientific explanation to be had. And then Eleanor gets curious. And the more she digs, the more she notices something off. Like how every shadow seems to shift just a little too quick. Or how, when she's flipping through these records, the temperature in the archive room starts to dip by a few degrees. Funny how things like that happen when you're nosing around in something that should have stayed buried. The dreams start to get weird. Real weird. She sees churches with empty pews. Handprints. Burned into stone. Of course, she didn't think to stop and ask, "Hey, maybe this is a sign I should leave this alone." No, she kept going. Because that's what curious historians do. They go where they shouldn't. And the shadowy figures? The ones that flit at the edges of your vision? Yeah, they started noticing her. And when something wants you, it doesn't just disappear. There's a line from one of Thorne's journal entries that hit her like a ton of bricks. It read, "The harvest shall not be interrupted. The offering will be complete. The gateway shall open when the appointed time arrives." Now, I don't know about you, but if I saw a journal entry like that, I'd probably be booking a one-way ticket out of town. But Eleanor? She kept going. She couldn't stop. And I get it, there's something about forbidden knowledge that calls to you. It's like a spider web that traps you the second you get too close. You can feel the vibrations, but it doesn't take long before you're tangled up in it. In the end, Eleanor made a horrifying discovery. Saint Ephraim wasn't an isolated incident. Not even close. It was a part of something much bigger. A pattern of soul harvesting stretching back decades. People like Ezekiel Thorne, people with too much faith in the wrong thing, had been pulling this off for years. And authorities? Oh, they couldn't figure it out. They didn't want to. Too much power. Too many people in high places who didn't want the truth out. So they shoved the journals away, labeled them as religious extremism, and hoped no one ever asked questions. But here's the kicker. When Eleanor uncovered that truth, she didn't just find knowledge. She found something that wasn't ready to stay buried. Something that had waited for her, for anyone, to step forward and expose the truth. And those forces? They're still out there. Watching. Waiting. Patient. Because the thing about cosmic horrors? They don't just vanish. They move through the shadows, feeding on the things we believe in, the things we trust. The survivors of Saint Ephraim? They didn't vanish. Not really. They're just guardians now. Guardians of a secret that can never be told. And if you ask around, maybe you'll get a little too close. Maybe someone, somewhere will ask about the handprint on the stone. Or that one church that burned down in a way that couldn't be explained. Just like the children who never really left. You know, those who were saved. Well, the thing is, the price of salvation is steep. And it's not always paid with money. You can't run from this. Not forever. I didn't want to believe it at first. I thought the journal was just a story. A relic of paranoia wrapped in frontier dust and religious hysteria. But then I found my grandmother's name in the Ashbridge census records from 1834, listed as a child among the vanished. That's when everything started to unravel. See, I'd always thought the scar on her wrist was from some farming accident. Something involving barbed wire and a cow with bad attitude. But after I read Reverend Thorne's ritual log, I realized it was the mark of the spared. A sigil carved into the chosen few before the rite began. You weren't sacrificed. You were branded to remember. And my grandmother? She remembered. Just not out loud. She used to hum strange hymns when she cooked. Soft and tuneless. like something she half remembered from a nightmare. I asked her once what the song was. She just said, "Don't ever follow it if you hear it in the woods. It doesn't stop singing once it knows you've heard." I laughed. I wish I hadn't. It ends, not with blood or screaming, but with silence. Eleanor disappeared 6 months after publishing a single article titled, "The Ashbridge Pattern, a Forgotten American Ritual Network." Most of it was redacted before it ever hit print. The final paragraph was untouched, though. It read, "If this is real, and I fear it is, we are not living in a world abandoned by the divine. We are living in a world rented out by something hungrier, something older than scripture, something patient. No one's seen Eleanor since. Well, not alive." They reopened the chapel of St. Ephraim in 1932. I know, after everything. New congregation, new name, different paint. You know how they love a good rebrand. But here's the thing. The pews were still there. The same warped oak. The same brass candle holders. The blood had long since been scrubbed away, of course, but if you scratched just beneath the varnish, you'd find symbols carved into the wood. A language that doesn't translate. Some say it's angelic. Others say it's something pretending to be divine. Either way, it whispers. One kid, a choir boy, went missing 3 weeks after the reopening. They found him 6 days later. He was smiling. His eyes were gone, burned out clean, but he had that same sigil carved on his chest. No one talks about that now. It's just one of those tragedies. And me? I kept going. Because that's what you do when you're obsessed, when you've seen too much. When you know there's something pulling the strings of our most sacred rituals. Wearing a preacher's face and speaking in tongues that bend the air around you. I've got my own journal now, just like Thorn. But mine's not written in faith. It's written in fear. Because here's the final truth. They never needed the chapel. They never needed the ritual to succeed. The attempt was enough. The intention is what opens the door, and enough of us have believed. Enough have followed sermons without question, offered prayers to voices in the dark, sang hymns without knowing who we were singing to. The door isn't locked anymore. It's ajar, and something ancient is waiting behind it, smiling with borrowed teeth. Because faith is a key, and we've all been turning it, one Sunday at a time. Final pause. So if you ever find yourself walking past an abandoned church, and the doors creak open on their own, just keep walking. And if you hear the hymn, don't hum it, don't follow it. And whatever you do, don't listen to the sermon. It's not meant for you anymore.